Welcome back to Presidents in Politics. I'm one of your hosts, Professor Caleb McGee, joined with my fellow co-host, former Congressman Ross.
Good morning.
And we were saying before the filming started, this is another challenging episode as we talk about the forgotten presidents.
Yeah, and this one's a tragic president.
He is.
And some of it's self-inflicted,
Yes.
and some of it's just circumstance. But,
Yes.
you know, who knew about Franklin Pierce? Who knows anything about Franklin Pierce?
Yes.
But what I can tell you that hadn't we not had a Franklin Pierce, we would probably never have had an Abraham Lincoln.
That's outstanding. Yeah, Abraham Lincoln in many ways shines like he does because of the backdrop of the surrounding presidents.
Yes.
It's almost like when you take a diamond, you put it on black velvet, so it pops out more. Like
Right.
Lincoln popped out because of the surrounding presidents, both that preceded him and that succeeded him.
Yeah.
You think about Johnson, like Lincoln just stands out, which we have one more we get to Lincoln, which is going to be a fun one, right? But Franklin Pierce, we made this statement kind of joking, but it's true. His life is kind of like a country song played out. Like, he is a tragic, tragic figure, and he's an alcoholic, which, I mean, the life that he lived, it's...
Yes. A charming man.
He was called the most handsome of presidents.
Yeah, but couldn't make a decision.
No, his nickname was Handsome Frank, and I believe I wrote this down because I found this super comical. It was Truman. President Truman said of him, he was the best-looking president until he took the White House. I remember when my wife and I did this. We were asked to do this Christmas pageant last minute, this Christmas musical, like a week before it went on. And acting is not my strong suit. I like going off the cuff. I hate scripts. And we were asked like this narration and stuff. And I dressed up as Joseph and she dressed up as Mary. And we did this whole thing. And it was horrible. Like, we got the notes like basically 2 days before we went in to do this thing. And I'll never forget at the end of the Christmas musical, this gentleman walked by my wife and I, and he said, "If nothing else, y'all looked good." And as I thought about the life of Franklin Pierce and specifically the presidency, maybe that's what would sum him up. If nothing else, he looked good. That's pretty much all he had going for him.
You know, it's good that you made the illusion of doing something with your wife, because I think Jane Pierce was a significant influence on Franklin's life, and she had tragedy herself.
Yes, and battled with depression greatly.
Battled with depression. Their first, they lost a son at birth. They lost another one to typhus just early on, and then their third child they witnessed
tragically.
He had 11 years old after he was elected president, and they're on a train.
Yes, 2 months before he'll take the inaugural oath.
And it derails. They're okay, but she witnesses, along with him, the tragic death of their 11-year-old son.
Yes.
And it was gruesome from what I understand.
Yeah, we're not exactly sure what took place. Some historical sources say he was decapitated. Some historical sources say that basically like the back of his skull was sheared off. Either way, it's a very gruesome, bloody death in front of his parents. And again, this is 2 months before he's going to take the oath and actually become president. And it affects the White House. It talks about the fact there was no inaugural ball when he comes in out of respect.
She did not go to Washington. She would not go to. She was against him going to Washington when he was a senator.
She's a pastor's kid and doesn't like the idea of politics. She's a teetotaler and he's an alcoholic. So they have these extreme differences that really come between their marriage a lot. In fact, Franklin Pierce, his religion, we really don't know about. He's very vague, and I did find some letters that I'll read closer to the end. But he kind of, because of her, he believes that in some ways God is judging him for not expressly saying that he's a Christian, and that's part of why he believes his son dies. It's really bad theology. Ooh. And this is one of the reasons why, I don't know if you've read this or not, but when he takes the oath of office, he's one of only 2 presidents who will not swear in on the Bible. I did not know that. He actually swears on a law book.
I did not know that.
And a lot of historians struggle with this, and some historians have said, well, it's because of the fact that he's not a believer. We're not sure. In his own writings, it hints the fact that he almost believes that God is like angry at him, because this is only 2 months after his son dies gruesomely and already lost 2 other children. So he's actually afraid that God is angry with him, and in some ways, some biographers have said out of respect, he swears on a law, but because he doesn't want to invoke the name of God when God is basically angry at him.
Wow.
So, and I found that so interesting because I remember throughout my life, there's been certain presidents, I won't name presidents, who they were unsure if they would swear on a Bible. Now, that's never happened before. Actually, it has happened before. And this was a president who did that.
Interesting.
And it also makes you wonder if that lack of faith, which we'll see it kind of grows later in his life, is one of the reasons why he was so ineffective.
Ambivalent, yes.
Yeah, and ambivalent as a president. He didn't have anything to stand firm on. He didn't stand firm on anything.
Well, it's interesting, just his background, because I understand he took a commission from General Winfield Scott
Yes.
as a major general, having
Yes.
no experience whatsoever in battle, and he sustains an injury when he falls off his horse. I mean, he had an unremarkable military career.
Yeah.
He was an unremarkable politician,
Yes.
although he was Speaker of the House of New Hampshire, I believe it was. Did serve in the United States Senate, but resigned early because his wife wanted him back home
Yes.
in Concord, and that's what he did. And then I guess it was on the 49th ballot at the convention that he's nominated for president.
Yes.
And what's really interesting is that as a Northerner, he's pro-slavery.
Yeah, he is a huge Southern sympathizer in every way, although he's born in New Hampshire, which he's the only president ever born in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
But I want to go to his military career. I like that you brought that up. Yeah, his first injury he sustains, he falls off his horse, but he hits the pommel on the way down, and it hurts him so badly he blacks out. I don't really know how to touch that, honestly. But here he is, and he's riding with guys like Old Fuss and Feathers. We have like Scott there.
Yeah.
And these type of guys he's riding with, and he falls off his surf and he blacks out from the pain because he hit his leg on the saddle.
Isn't that amazing, though, that the guy that gave him his commission is the guy that he beat
Yes.
for president, General Winfield Scott?
Who then Scott doesn't like him later, and Scott actually accuses him between the lines, because he didn't want to get sued for slander, between the lines of cowardice, because if you study the military career of Pierce, he always got injured right before a major battle.
I did not know that.
And later, Scott made the statement that the only hard-fought battle that Pierce ever had was with the bottle.
I heard that, yeah. Amazing.
Yeah,
Amazing.
so-
And you wonder about this guy being president of the United States. At a time when, when slavery was really starting to boil over, the abolitionists, you had the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Yes. With John Brown.
Yeah, this was his downfall. This was one of the reasons for his downfall.
Yes.
Is that the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, which takes these two territories, which are not states, and they're bigger than the states that are today.
Much.
And says, okay, but we're going to use, what was it, popular sovereignty
Yes.
to determine whether you're going to be a slave state or not. And the abolitionists are just beside themselves because it revokes the Missouri Compromise.
Which is only, 35 years old at this point, something like that?
Yeah. And here you go, and so they say, okay, well, Kansas, you decide. Well, all the pro-slavery people are moving into Kansas and establish their own government, and then all the anti-slavery people are moving into Kansas. They start this bloody...
It's kind of the mini Civil War.
It is. And in fact, it leads to the Civil War. And you're right, John Brown.
Yes. And going back to this idea of the Southerners running up for vote, they call them border ruffians.
Yeah.
And a lot of them would come from Missouri, rush up, and they would vote and then rush back down. And it was a huge issue of voter fraud, which...
Really? I thought we invented that. I thought our generation invented that.
Like, if you ever talk about the idea of voter fraud, and that's all we hear about in the last couple elections, and specifically the last elections, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. This was happening at an alarming rate in the 1800s, much more than it's ever happened in contemporary society.
With probably a more difficult way of trying to track it and trace it and find it out.
So you literally have Missouri at the bottom of these new territories. Again, these border ruffians, they're all pro-slavery. They rush up, they vote in all these elections. Then by violence, they try to keep the abolitionists away. They vote in slavery acts, and they rush back down to Missouri. It's a huge voter fraud. Most abolitionists at this point are very pacifist, right? They don't want to fight.
True.
Until John Brown.
Yes.
And bloody John Brown.
And his sons, I guess.
5 sons, right?
Yeah.
And, of course, the most iconic or the most legendary is that they take broadswords, like Scottish broadswords, and they start hacking apart pro-slavery men in their front yards out of retribution.
That doesn't end well.
No, and it's one of the things that leads to this mini civil war, if you will, that takes place. I think it was something like by the end, there's over 200 deaths on both sides.
I did not know that.
And while this mini civil war is going on in bloody Kansas, you have, and you know this very well from your time, you have an absolute mess in Congress. People like beating each other with canes, pulling guns on each other.
Yes.
I mean,
this is he takes over at a tranquil time in American history and absolutely creates this uproar of confusion, chaos, and violence. Like you said, there was the caning on the Senate floor.
And there's literally bleeding on the... there's blood running down the Senate floor. And when some of his compatriots try to come and help him, you have other guys walk up and basically just showing arms, stay away, letting keep beating him with a cane. Yeah. I mean, from your time in Congress, have you ever seen things almost get physical?
Not really, no.
Okay.
No, I retired before the speaker's race just 2 years ago or whatever, and
the current issue,
and they'll probably I don't know. I don't think that anybody will get to fisticuffs or violence. But there is also the sergeant of arms is very strong in both chambers, and I think that that's going to be very effective. That we won't see a repeat of what happened, during Pierce's time as president, at least on the House or Senate floor. That doesn't mean we won't see it outside the chambers as we have just recently.
Yes.
But this guy, he whatever he touched didn't seem to work. What was that? They wanted to go in and try to take over Cuba.
Yes, he greatly wanted to annex Cuba.
Yes, because they were afraid of what would happen in Haiti with the slavery uprising. That might happen in Cuba, and
Cuba's 60 miles from Florida.
Yeah, and that's going to adversely impact the slave trade. So let's go down and get Cuba from Spain, and if they don't like it, we're going to take them over.
Yes. Which is Fillmore, his predecessor, was his same diplomatic style with Japan, right?
Right.
He tries the exact same thing, but it doesn't work with Spain. It's an old monarchy.
Right. Yeah. And they publicize it, and that what was it, the Ostend Memo?
I know what you're talking
manifesto.
about. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And that comes out, and it just is a black eye for his administration, because it basically says if they don't agree to sell it to us, we're coming in to take it violently. And, say what you might, but it's probably good that didn't happen. We got issues with Cuba today, but I'm not so sure that we would have been able to handle it over the last 100 and some years. So
yeah, and he was willing to pay something like $130 million, which is huge. I mean, that's more than we paid for the Oregon territories, right?
Yep.
He's willing to pay a massive amount for this tiny island. And had he just simply come respectfully like, hey, I'll pay you $130 million, they probably would have sold it in a heartbeat. Like, honestly, it was a massive amount of money. But he comes in with that just kind of power positioning, and it does not sit well.
I think, Stephen Douglas was very influential on him, and I think Stephen Douglas identified him as a very weak president and knew that he could bowl him over, and did just that with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But also, when you're looking at the expansion of the territory westward, and you're looking at these railroads that want to come through there, and they start utilizing their influence on him to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
And here's a poor president that just was. He just didn't have control of himself, let alone this country.
No, I think that's a good way to look at it. Is he had pretty much lack of self-discipline in every area of his life, and that's something we've talked a lot about with these early founding fathers, and then later presidents like Roosevelt and others. Is they endured voluntary hardship in order to build this resolute character, and Franklin Pierce did not have resolute character.
No, he did not. In fact, let me just read you something that was printed upon his death. The New York Herald marked his death with the following blunt statement. The deceased was a man of something more than average ability. He possessed, however, none of the attributes of greatness.
Wow.
And was more of a cautious, studious, and watchful politician than a comprehensive, far-seeing, or observant statesman. This is a former president that the New York Herald is writing about, and it's probably spot on.
Yes.
But, you've talked about greatness, and because of the fact that he was not a great president, as we said earlier in the broadcast, it did lead to a great president.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely. One of his best friends, actually, believe it or not, was Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter. They went to college together. And upon his death, Hawthorne actually wrote as well, speaking about and now this is bad when this is the best thing that even your friends can say about you. And this is Hawthorne. He said, "There are scores of men in the country that seem brighter than he is." Okay, now he went to college with him, so
then they're friends,
right? Okay, but he has the directing mind and will to move them about like pawns on a chessboard and turn all their abilities to a better purpose. So basically, the best thing that they could say about you is you're a manipulator.
Yeah,
is that literally like your best attribute they could pull out? Is that you're not that bright? But you sure can't manipulate people.
And that's probably why nobody really knows anything about Franklin Pierce.
Agreed.
Because everything he seemed to do did not turn out well for the United States.
I scoured looking for any successful piece of legislation that he was able to accomplish. There's two things he did that are considered positive throughout his presidency. Here's the first one. This is massive. Are you ready?
Yes.
Under him, stamps were perforated. So no longer are you going to tear and get your stamp. He's the first president
to perforate them.
And I find this comical that the forgotten presidents are obsessed with stamps. Remember Millard Fillmore lowers the price. It's his only accomplishment.
Yeah.
And now his predecessor, Pierce, says, let's perforate the stamps. And here's his second great act of legislation. I don't know if you're ready for this or not. He has the Guano Island Act of 1856. And what this was the unclaimed islands in the Pacific, like Midway and others, were now American rights on bird poop for fertilizer.
Come on.
And farmers love him for this. And these are his only two successful acts, really, that he will do throughout his presidency. He'll perforate stamps, and he'll get the rights to bird crap.
Wow. Oh.
So,
you wonder about today. And you wonder about today, the legacy of our modern day presidents. Well, that's not a very high standard if you're looking at Franklin Pierce.
I mean, yeah, if you ever run for office, just compare yourself to him.
Yes.
And you're going to feel like a success.
You're right.
I mean, if I could do better than perforated stamps and bird poop,
you're right.
then I'm doing all right. So yeah, we talked about the Kansas Missouri Act and the Kansas Nebraska Act. That is such an issue. Now the Civil War, once the Civil War starts, he is no longer president. Obviously,
no.
His health is failing.
He does not care for Abraham Lincoln.
He hates Lincoln.
Yes, he denounces the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yes. And then what I found interesting, and I've read a lot of this before, and I went back to this and read this again, he attempts to have a meeting with the 5 living presidents during the Civil War. So he reaches out, and I don't have all of them memorized, but it's of course, you have, the oldest would have been Van Buren. He reaches out to Van Buren and himself and Fillmore, and there's 2 others. And there's 5 living presidents at the time. Zachary Taylor, and there's one more. And off the top of my head, I cannot think who the 5th was. But he reaches out to the 5 living presidents, and they want to meet together in Philadelphia and start talking about how to resolve the Civil War.
Wow.
Because he so distrusts the power of Lincoln. And it's actually Van Buren, who was the oldest president, who Van Buren was kind of wishy-washy too. And he's like, I'll show up if everyone else does, but I'm going to be the last one to come if everyone else comes, and I won't lead it. Because they asked him to lead it because he was the oldest. And then later, when it kind of started hitting the press more, Van Buren's like, no, I don't want him to do that because we're not going to undermine the power of Lincoln. And it raises some interesting questions. How much influence should a former president have over the country? What are your thoughts on this? If you have former presidents, I can see it as both being a positive and a negative thing.
I think only a resource when called upon.
Okay.
I think that's the beauty of the succession of presidencies, is that you have a new person doing their agenda that they were elected to do, and let them do that. But as a former president, you make yourself available as a resource if called upon.
Good.
I don't think you should interject yourself. I don't think that that's healthy. I think that it leads to some distrust, and I think it's not healthy for the office itself. I mean, we've got to understand, that was the beauty of George Washington. He showed the peaceful succession of power.
Yes.
And if we don't have that, and if we're going to constantly interject as a former president on the next administration, I think that that's not healthy.
I agree.
And that's why we have votes every 4 years.
That's one of the reasons why, honestly, I believe that the office of president was initially the ideal was it would be an older man. As much as we have and I understand that it's taken to the ridiculous level in today's time, right? Like if you can't walk across the stage, you probably shouldn't be president. I understand that. But what if you elect someone who's 35 and he has a successful term and he's loved by the country, and then the next 40 years he's kind of like going around, he's really the power of the country, and people. I mean, there are those questions that you begin to raise. Like, as you said, Washington, he's an older guy for the time period. He retires to his farm and kind of wants to be left alone. So it's an interesting thought process. We're probably one of the only countries in the world, specifically this time period, less so now, where you have leaders who are controlling the free world, and then you just go back to being a civilian.
Yeah. Usually they're either dead or exiled. We're one of the few countries that allow for that.
Yes, and it just makes a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah. So what do you do with an ex-president? Well, I think you put him in a university. You put him, but to be the spokesperson against the predecessor, I don't think is healthy.
It reminds me. I don't know if you're a Rocky fan or not, but if you remember from Rocky 3 with it's Rocky 4, and if you remember Rocky's best friend, who Carl Weathers played, and he talks about the fact that he's going to come out of retirement. Yeah, it's Apollo Creed, and he makes the statement. He says, "Fighters can't retire," and he gives that whole monologue about how generals can retire and they can, but fighters can't retire, and it almost makes you think about like this role as president. Like, how does a president retire in a respectful way that's not getting in the way of future power? And this is something Franklin Pierce did not know how to do. Like,
that's true.
He always thought he still kind of had the power of president. He always thought of himself kind of a little higher than Lincoln.
Yes, he did. And it's interesting that his own party wouldn't even consider him.
Only president.
Yeah, for re-election.
He's the only nominated president who was never actually renominated, and he's
party.
A seating president. That's never happened before.
That shows you the tragedy of his presidency, and that's so unfortunate for him.
Yes.
But again, it ultimately leads to a great president in Abraham Lincoln.
Agreed. When we talk about Lincoln, when Lincoln is assassinated, because Pierce is still alive when Lincoln's assassinated, where Pierce is living, all of the houses, the mansions, which, by the way, when he retires from presidency, his first house, his retirement home, is burned to the ground. So yet again, that's just another, like, Pierce's life is just tragic, right?
It is.
I mean, every kid he
His
has.
vice president dies.
Yes, and
His
never,
vice
you know,
president, yes.
and never even holds power. He was in Cuba when he's sworn in, and he goes back to Alabama, because I think he's one of the only vice presidents from Alabama, right? I mean, there's so many jokes we could. I'm not going to. I'm going to leave that alone. I'm from Okeechobee. I can't make those. But nonetheless, yeah, like you said, his vice president dies. I mean, like, how much more tragic could this guy's life be?
It is a series of tragedies all throughout his life.
It's Shakespearean at a level of tragedy. It seriously is. Like, it okay, if this was written in fiction, as a critic, you'd be like, you're overdoing this.
Yeah.
Right? But it's real. This is actually what happened. Yeah. But anyway, when Lincoln is assassinated, in his neighborhood, all the houses hang a giant American flag in solidarity for the death of Lincoln. And Pierce doesn't hang a flag over his house. A mob amasses at his door asking why. And Pierce, who's honestly probably half drunk at the time, stumbles out and says that his long years of service speak much louder than a flag ever could.
Wow.
And goes back in his house.
An angry man.
An angry man.
Yes.
It was actually said that when he's not nominated again, so he loses the nomination to his own party, he's going out of the White House. One of his final quotes, and I'm not sure if this is American legend or not, but I found it under multiple sources. He said, "There's nothing left to do but get drunk."
What a sad commentary. And, there's not much to say about him other than, he was a tragedy, unfortunately.
He was.
And his poor wife. The man lost all three of his children. He took the country into an area they should never have done.
He expedited the Civil War.
His Secretary of War was Jefferson Davis. The future Confederacy, president of the Confederacy. So the whole thing was just an absolute recipe for chaotic disaster for this country.
Yes.
And could have been avoided.
Yes.
But again, I have to say, I think it's without a doubt in my mind, divine intervention that brings us back because of the brilliance of the Constitution and the process that we have for this country. And we bring people in that can correct this if we allow them to do it.
It almost reminds me, when we talk the providential hand of God, it reminds me of the book of Judges, where these foreign powers would oppress the nation of Israel for 30, 40 years, and then God would raise up a deliverer, the Bible says, and then the land would have peace. And in some ways, Abraham Lincoln was that man that God raised up, and the land ultimately had peace. Now, not during his lifetime, obviously, but because of his administration, because of the Emancipation Proclamation, because of the absolute insightful leadership that he had.
The perseverance of his leadership. He should have given up so many times with the elections
Agreed.
he lost with. He even had his own tragedies.
Yes.
But and again, and I love your distinction between good and great. And I don't even know if Franklin Pierce was a good man. I assume he was, but even the New York Herald says that his greatness was not.
Yeah, he was definitely not a great man.
Yeah.
So his faith, I think we should touch on this. They say when he was in college, he was pretty religious. That he would kneel nightly with his roommates and pray. That he would say grace over his meals. However, as he gets more and more involved in politics, he begins to lose that fervor.
Yeah.
Because he was a sellout. Let's just say it. Like, he was one of those guys that he was so friendly that whoever he was around, he was just gonna go along with them.
Right.
This was Pierce. And then upon the tragedy of his kids dying, he gets almost more and more resentment with God. And his wife is we can use it, kind of a legalistic pastor's kid, and she's probably kind of laying the guilt on him. So there's this weird dynamic going on in his own personal faith. He won't actually really profess he is a follower of Christ until he leaves the White House. And when he leaves the White House, he will actually get baptized in the Episcopal Church.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and then he'll make this statement. My mind has long been impressed with the fact that if our present life is not probationary, that is getting ready for, in its character, if we are not placed here as the blessed word of God teaches to prepare us for another and more exalted state of being, we are destined to waste our energies upon things that are unsubstantial, fleeting, passing away, and that cannot bring permanent peace, that cannot give calm or hope. There must be an anchor for the soul.
Wow. Even him.
Yes. Which he could speak about that idea of uncommonness and of problems and of brokenness. And I think here at the end of his life, you see him looking for something more.
Yeah. As in most cases.
Yeah. I think you and I can both say, and you a little more than me, that the older you get, the more you begin to face your own mortality.
Oh, absolutely.
And that begins to make you wonder, there's got to be more than this.
Absolutely. I felt that in Congress.
Gotta be more. I'm sure. There's
That's
got to be
one of the
more than
reasons I
this.
decided to get out of Congress, because there was more to this, and there has to be more, something more fulfilling. And I think that once you become, in touch with that, face to face with that the passion really starts going.
I like that.
That it's not the titles anymore. It's about what can I do to do what I know I need to do, because there's something greater than me, and it's pushing me, and that is my faith.
I like that. And you see Pierce as a broken Shakespearean tragedy character. And yet again, and I know that we're at a Christian university. I know I'm a bivocational pastor, but at the end of his life, he says the only thing that makes any sense is faith. He's tried it all. He's had the power. He's had the power of the nation at his fingertips.
It's something that we all struggle with, because that's why it's called faith.
Absolutely. He's had the power of the nation at his fingertips. He's had about every bottle you can think of.
Yeah.
He's had he was good looking. He was athletic. He loved to fish. I mean, everything the world at this time period said you needed to be happy. He had really popular, important friends.
Yeah.
Hawthorne's his buddy. They were sitting around writing literature together. He had a military career. I mean, can
he
we
was
really?
in the military.
I like that distinction a lot. And at the end of his life, the only thing he can say that matters is faith. He said, I've got to find an anchor for my soul, or all this is meaningless.
Boy, that's powerful.
Yes, it is. So this has been the life of Franklin Pierce, and we're getting closer to the good ones.
Yes, we are.
We're starting to leave the forgotten presidents.
Yep, one more.
Can we leave them behind? I mean,
history has.
Exactly. Thank you very much for listening to Presidents in Politics.